Hello and welcome. I call the channel the Jungle Nook, and today I want to talk a little bit about coffee grounds. We will get into some of the myths and misconceptions regarding them as far as pest and weed control, using them to amend your soil to pH to make it a little more acidic. Um, but coffee grounds are good if used appropriately, and that's what I want to really talk about. So yeah, there's been some good studies done on coffee grounds. I recently read one that was funded by Starbucks. I assume they're trying to, they were looking in to see if they could find a way to get rid of them to reduce their costs or maybe even make a profit off of them. But coffee grounds, they, like I said, they're good. There are benefits, but you got to be real careful with them. First, the nutrients. There is a lot of nutrients and acidity in coffee grounds. But once you've made your coffee with the hot water, you've extracted all of the readily available nutrients and nearly all of the acidity. But there are still some nutrients left in those grounds. I made a video a while back talking about organics. And in that video, I explained, like, if you're using a compost, usually within 3 to 6 months, nearly all of the nutrients, the readily available nutrients, have already been broken down within 3 to 6 months. That's all the smaller pieces of organic material. And then those larger, chunkier pieces, the bark or little twigs and stuff, can take several years before they've fully broken down. Coffee grounds are like those chunkier pieces. So it really takes about a year before they really start breaking down and releasing the nutrients. And, they have done studies. Not all beans, not all the coffee beans are the same, but pretty much after you've made your coffee, what's left within the ground, those primary nutrients, the first three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that's at a 2.3.3. So there's a lot more nitrogen that's going to be released than the other two. But that nitrogen is, it's going to take quite a while before it starts slowly releasing it. But there's also caffeine left in these grounds. Now, the caffeine, that does take about a full year before the caffeine degrades or breaks down and is no longer caffeine. Caffeine will stunt the growth of your plants. I have said how plants do produce things like caffeine and nicotine to help fight off pests. Once the plant has identified, they have a problem, they'll start producing caffeine. But that's being produced within the plant. If the plant is absorbing caffeine, it will stunt the growth of your plant. My recommendation is, if you have a compost pile, is to compost your used coffee grounds for a year within that compost, and then use that compost around your plants to build up your beds and things. If you're going to put it directly into the bed, I would not recommend mixing it in with the soil. I also would not recommend mixing it into your potted plants neither, because of that caffeine. I got squirrels running around on the porch. So yeah, I would not recommend mixing the used coffee grounds directly into the soil, because they will be releasing slowly that caffeine, which can stunt the growth of the plant. But you can use it as a mulch in your perennial beds. But you want to use a thin layer. I would recommend around a half inch, no more than an inch. Now that caffeine will be getting released, but it will pretty much be neutralized as it's working its way through the soil. That's why you wouldn't mix it into the soil so that it's in contact with the roots. You could use it as a mulch, but the reason you don't want to use more than an inch of it is because once you get to or past that 1 inch thickness using it as mulch, when it gets wet and then dries, it kind of bonds with itself. And when it's that thick and like a little over an inch or more, water will actually run off of it. It will have a hard time penetrating the coffee grounds that you're using as a mulch, but you can use them as a mulch on your perennial beds. I wouldn't use them on annuals, an annual bed, or your vegetable gardens, where you're putting in smaller plants and a lot of those roots are going to be closer up towards the surface. But your perennials that are well established with the deeper root structure, root system, it's fine. Now, another reason why you don't want to use more than about an inch, I recommend a half inch, is because coffee grounds, when they're too thick, will also promote mold and fungus, even the harmful fungus, pathogens, things that can cause root rot or dampening off. If you're familiar with that term, it's what dampening off is. It's actually a harmful fungus, I believe. It's a fungus that will attack the root structure of your freshly germinated seeds. So you don't want to use coffee grounds as a mulch around any of your vegetable gardens or around your annuals, and definitely not in with your seedlings when you're trying to germinate seedlings or where you're planting seedlings. And as far as using them to increase the acidity of the soil, really coffee grounds, once you've made coffee with them, they're pretty much neutral. They're neutral. They might be slightly acidic, but I mean, not enough to where you're going to actually increase the acidity. Coffee grounds basically are neutral once you've used them to make coffee. I really don't recommend using them in a pot at all, because if you're mixing them in with the soil or you're top dressing your pots with them, it takes a long time for that caffeine to become depleted or to break down or turn into a new compound, a different compound. The pot's so small, you don't want to have caffeine in that soil medium. It will stunt the growth of your plants. I've watched videos where people are recommending putting them in your vegetable garden, and they are, I give them credit because they're showing the garden as they put it in, as they're planting their tomatoes or their cucumbers or whatever. They go through, they use the coffee grounds on all their plants, and then they're showing their yield at the end of the year. And it's a decent looking yield. But they don't have a control group. They're doing all their plants, and they're like, look what I got. Where they might be surprised if they, had a section of their garden where they did not use them, so they can compare. Coffee grounds are recommended for pest control, especially for things like snails and slugs and ants. There have been, some experimentations done that I watched where, slugs and snails will go right over coffee grounds. They multiple times they would make a circle around them and they'd go right over it, or they'd do a circle and leave openings. They didn't go through the openings. They went right over the coffee grounds. In one of them that I watched, not only did the slugs that they put in the center, it was outside, did they leave, but different slugs went over the night, went right over them. They didn't affect them at all. Same with ants. I've seen it where they made circles around the mounds, covered the mounds. The ants had no problem moving them, walking over them. It didn't have any effect at all. There's been some studies done too on the effects of coffee grounds with earthworms. People that breed night crawlers and stuff and worms for fishing, or that breed them and use them to make worm castings and stuff, they do actually mix coffee grounds right into the materials that they're feeding them, into the compost that they're using. Coffee grounds are totally fine. You just can't feed earthworms 100% coffee grounds. It's not good for them. They will die. But coffee grounds are fine in moderation in your garden, in your lawn, for the environment. It's a great way to recycle them so they're not going into the landfill. But as far as pest control, it's really not going to do anything for you. The caffeine needs to be in the plant. The plant produces it specifically for certain types of pests within its tissue. And weed control, this is fun. So I am a landscaper and gardener by trade. A lot of times people will, they'll be asking me, is that a weed or a plant? Well, weeds are plants. So if you think about it, how can putting used coffee grounds around plants control the weeds, stunt the weed's growth, or kill the weed? But also, if you put them around the plants that you want, your ornamentals and your vegetables, how does it help them and make them more lush and full and grow better and have a better yield? We're basically being told they do two different things. Coffee grounds will stunt the growth of your plant if you have not given them time to release the caffeine. Or you can use, like I said, you can use them as a mulch, but a thin layer of mulch around your perennials, because the perennials have a deeper root system. They're organic. They are a good product to use in moderation. You can sprinkle them over your lawn, on your raised beds. It's fine. It's when they're in contact and right around the root structure. Freshly used coffee grounds. When I say freshly used, I mean the first year. Now the nutrients that they release, that nitrogen, like I said, it's gonna take about a year before that nitrogen starts getting released. And it's going to take some time for all of that nitrogen to be released. Still a good source of nitrogen. And it's organic. It will definitely help to build your soil. I really would not use it in your houseplants. Maybe if you have a really acid-loving plant, yeah, you could mix a little bit into the soil, but be aware that, it releases it at such a small amount, it's really not going to make much of a difference. You would have to put so much in that you could now be causing a problem with harmful pathogens that would like to feed off of those coffee grounds. If you're a coffee drinker and your family's a coffee drinker and you have a lot of coffee grounds but you don't really have a compost pile, you could add things like grass clippings, leaves. Some people aren't comfortable using their table scraps, because of rodents or whatever. But yeah, grass, clippings, leaves, all sorts of stuff like that you could mix in with the coffee grounds, and that will give you a nice mixture of green and brown composting materials that break down nice and quick for you.